On the morning of November 24, 1944, in a limestone sinkhole the Marines had started calling Death Valley, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa of the Imperial Japanese Army sent his final radio transmission to General Sadianao, sitting safely on the neighboring island of Koror. 70 days of siege had reduced Nakagawa's once-proud 2nd Infantry Regiment to a scattering of starving men hiding in tunnels. Mid-transmission, the line simply went dead. Inao, listening on the other end, assumed for a moment that the Americans had finally blown the command post apart entirely, killing everyone inside. He was wrong, and it would take American investigators years after the war to piece together exactly what had happened in that final hour. Before Nakagawa burned his regimental colors, an act of finality in Japanese military tradition, a formal declaration that the unit itself had ceased to exist, and before he ended his own life by ritual suicide, he sent one last message north. It is the line by which history remembers him. Our sword is broken, and we have run out of spears. It is an unusual thing to build a documentary about American Marines around a defeated enemy commander's final words. But this isn't the sanitized version of Peleliu, the one where a division storms a beach, plants a flag, and the story moves briskly along to the next island in the chain. This is the version where the enemy colonel spent months studying the men who were coming for him, built an entirely new kind of defense specifically engineered to break them, and still, in the end, reached for the image of a broken sword rather than the word defeat. To understand why that particular image was the one he chose, you first have to understand who he had been fighting and who he was. Nakagawa was not some panicked garrison commander thrown onto a Pacific atoll with no plan. He was a career soldier, born in 1898 in Kumamoto Prefecture, a graduate of the 30th class of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, and a veteran with real combat experience going back to the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937 and years of subsequent fighting in Shanxi Province during the Second Sino-Japanese War. By 1943, he held the Order of the Golden Kite in command of the IJA 2nd Infantry Regiment under the 14th Division. This was not a man improvising under pressure. This was a professional soldier who studied the record of previous Pacific Island battles and concluded that nearly everything the Imperial Army had been doing on those islands was a mistake. At Tarawa and Saipan, Japanese garrisons had thrown themselves at American lines in mass banzai charges, desperate, doomed, and over within a day or two. Nakagawa studied those defeats and made a decision that would reshape the remainder of the Pacific War. He would not meet the Marines on the beach and die gloriously in one afternoon. He would go underground instead and force them to bleed for every yard of ground for as long as it took to break something in them. He built his defense inside the Umerbragal, a spine of coral ridges honeycombed with more than 500 natural and reinforced caves, connected by tunnels, sealed in places behind sliding steel doors, each firing position sited to support 2 or 3 neighboring ones in overlapping, interlocking fields of fire. A Japanese soldier who had helped construct it left behind a description that survived the war intact. He called Peleliu a large, unsinkable battleship. It was designed to be a killing machine that naval bombardment could not locate and could not silence, and largely, it performed exactly as designed. 3 days of pre-invasion shelling from American ships and carrier aircraft stripped the jungle canopy from the ridge and exposed a maze of cliffs, gullies, and box canyons beneath it. It did almost nothing to the defenses hidden inside them. The men coming for that ridge belonged to the 1st Marine Division, nicknamed the Old Breed, a name earned 2 years earlier at Guadalcanal and worn afterward like an inheritance. The division had been activated at sea on February 1, 1941, the first division in Marine Corps history, and by September 1944 it considered itself among the most seasoned combat formations in the entire Pacific Theater, having already fought through Guadalcanal and the New Britain campaign at Cape Gloucester. Going into Peleliu, the division believed it understood exactly what a Japanese island defense looked like. That confidence explains why what happened on the morning of September 15, 1944, felt, to the men living through it, almost like a betrayal of everything they had been led to expect. Standard amphibious doctrine called for an assault force to outnumber island defenders roughly 3-1. The division's 3 infantry regiments, the 1st, 5th, and 7th Marines, landed with about 9,000 riflemen between them. Japanese intelligence estimates later confirmed what the Marines only slowly discovered. Nakagawa had more than 11,000 men dug into the ridges waiting for them. The Marines went ashore already outnumbered, not the other way around. As the Amtraks churned toward the invasion beaches, codenamed White and Orange, many of the Marines aboard were, by multiple accounts, almost carefree. Witnesses recalled choruses of "Give My Regards to Broadway" drifting across the water toward an island that, from a distance, looked calm and unremarkable. It did not stay calm for long. Tom Lee, an artist and correspondent for Life magazine who rode ashore in the first wave, later described what he saw on that beach in words that have outlived nearly everything else written about that day. He recalled the Marines pinned flat in the sand looking dark and huddled, like drowned animals caught in the surf. Nakagawa's mortars, artillery, and machine guns had been pre-registered, aimed, and ranged in advance on every foot of that landing zone long before a single Marine set foot on it. Among the replacements who came ashore that week was a 20-year-old mortarman from Mobile, Alabama, named Eugene Sledge, who had joined K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, as a replacement after the division's rest period on Pavuvu in the Russell Islands. Sledge later wrote that he had walked into a proud, veteran outfit made up overwhelmingly of very young men. By his own account, roughly 85% of the company hadn't yet turned 21. His memoir of those weeks, written originally as a private record for his own family and not published until decades later, would become one of the most widely read first-hand accounts to come out of the entire war. Sledge's account of the airfield assault gives a sense of how quickly the Marines' confidence collapsed against the reality of Nakagawa's defense. Ordered to cross the open airfield at a trot under direct observed fire from the high ground, the Marines had already started calling Bloody Nose Ridge. Sledge's unit came under counterattack from Japanese light tanks and infantry hidden in the scrub bordering the field. His squad leader, R.V. Burgeon, called out range and direction, while a veteran gunner nicknamed Snafu, Shelton, worked the sights of their 60 mortar. In the chaos, a Sherman tank crewman, a Marine Sledge remembered simply as Hank, exposed the entire time atop his vehicle, while Japanese fire poured in from every direction, held his position through the engagement without a scratch, and was credited afterward with helping prevent the destruction of the entire company. He was awarded a Silver Star for it. Sledge would later say it should have been the Medal of Honor. By the time the ambush was over, 4 Japanese field guns and roughly 200 Japanese infantry hidden in the underbrush had been accounted for. There had been no way to see any of it coming because on Peleliu, as Sledge put it, there was no such thing as a front line. The whole island was one. The airfield itself fell within the first 2 days, a real tactical success, and for a brief window it looked as though the division's early prediction of a short, 4-day campaign might actually hold. It did not hold. What followed instead was a siege that stretched to nearly 3 months, almost entirely concentrated on that same spine of coral, barely 2 miles long. Accounts differ slightly on exactly when senior Marine leadership grasped the scale of what they were actually facing, but the pattern in the record is consistent. Division Command, having succeeded with more conventional frontal assault tactics at Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, kept applying those same tactics against a defense that had been specifically engineered to defeat them. Lieutenant Colonel Harold "Bucky" Harris, commanding the 5th Marines, surveyed the Umerbrogel from an observation aircraft and urged an attack against its less heavily defended northern face instead of the costly frontal assaults already underway. The advice went unheeded. The 1st Marines under Colonel Louis "Chesty" Puller absorbed the price of that decision most directly. Major Ray Davis's 1st Battalion alone lost roughly 70% of its strength in the ridge fighting, its rifle companies reduced, in one Marine officer's post-war account, to barely a corporal's guard. Around the 5th or 6th day of the battle, a message from the division's commanding general was read aloud to the men on the line, assuring them that Marines would not need the Army's help to finish the job. Sledge recalled the news being met with open cursing up and down the position. Men who had just watched their friends die for that pride had little patience left for it. It was Major General William Rupertus himself, the general who had confidently predicted a 4-day battle before the landing, who gave the war's most unguarded admission of how completely that prediction had failed. To an aide, reportedly close to tears, he confessed that the fight had very nearly beaten him. And still, the record shows, he refused to summon the Army's 81st Infantry Division, fighting nearby on the neighboring island of Angor against a much smaller garrison, because he wanted the victory on Peleliu to belong to Marines alone. Relief for the battered 1st Marines did not arrive until the 81st was finally brought in 6 days after the landing, at the insistence of the theater commander. Sledge's own account of those weeks reads less like a battle narrative than a description of a place that had stopped resembling anywhere fit for human beings. He described digging foxholes into ground so saturated with the buried and unburied dead that a single shovelful of coral mud could turn up human remains and send men reeling backward, retching. He would later write that something in him, some earlier, more innocent understanding of what people were capable of, simply did not survive Peleliu intact. He called his time on that exposed airfield under direct fire from the ridge the worst combat experience of his entire war, worse, by his own later reckoning, than anything Okinawa would throw at him the following spring. What makes Peleliu different from almost every earlier Pacific battle isn't only Nakagawa's tactics, it's the belief system that was sustaining his men through them. Japanese soldiers of the period were trained to understand their own deaths through a specific concept, Jyokusai, shattered jewels, a phrase borrowed by 19th century samurai tradition from a 7th century Chinese text, holding that a great man ought to die shattered like a jewel rather than survive whole like an unbroken roof tile. It was not simply wartime propaganda. It was a deliberate piece of psychological architecture, built to make prolonged, hopeless resistance feel like the highest expression of honor rather than the waste that it plainly was. Emperor Hirohito himself sent 11 separate telegrams to the Peleliu garrison over the course of the siege, more direct personal communications than he sent to any other single battle of the entire war, reinforcing to Nakagawa's dwindling command that the nation was watching them hold their ground. Radio broadcasts from Japan reached the island periodically as well, reminding the defenders that the entire country was counting on every additional day they could buy. Whatever else can be said about the defense of Peleliu, it was not fought by men who believed they could win it. It was fought by men trained to believe that losing correctly was its own form of victory, and that belief was reinforced constantly, deliberately, from the very top of the imperial chain of command down to the last private in the last tunnel. The numbers at the end of the battle show how completely that training held. Of roughly 11,000 Japanese troops present on the island at the start of the fighting, only 19 ever surrendered or were taken prisoner. A handful of Korean and Okinawan laborers pressed into service made up most of those who did. Every other man fought until he was killed. It is worth sitting with that figure for a moment because it is not a statistic that shows up often in military history. An entire garrison, numbering in the thousands, effectively refusing the option of surrender almost to the last man, on an island its own high command had already privately written off as expendable months before the Marines ever arrived. If the battle has a single hinge moment, it is not a charge or a breakthrough. It is the day Japanese command accepted that the fight was already lost and kept fighting anyway. On November 24, 1944, 10 weeks into a battle originally projected to last 4 days, Nakagawa and his co-commander, Major General Kenjiro Murai, gathered in their final command post in the area the Marines had by then simply started calling Death Valley. No relief was coming, and there had never really been a realistic chance of one. And still, by every account that survived the war, neither man attempted to surrender or slip away in the dark. They burned their colors and performed ritual suicide together. 3 days later, on November 27, 1944, American forces formally declared Peleliu secure. There is one more layer to this story that makes Nakagawa's stand even harder to reconcile, and it has nothing to do with tactics. Peleliu was invaded in the first place because Allied planners believed its airfield posed a threat to the flank of General Douglas MacArthur's coming invasion of the Philippines. It was meant to be neutralized quickly, in passing, on the way to a larger objective. By the time the fighting was finally over in late November, the strategic picture elsewhere in the Pacific had already shifted enough that many historians looking back on the campaign have concluded the airfield was barely used for its intended purpose at all. Whatever Nakagawa was buying with his men's lives, in other words, may not have been worth what it cost to sell. That makes the discipline of his defense more remarkable, not less. Archaeological surveys of the island conducted decades later found a telling detail buried among the ruins of the ridge positions. Much of the Japanese equipment recovered there, helmets, rifles, was strikingly poor in quality by comparison with American gear, thin cast iron liable to shatter under fire, rifles prone to jamming and simply abandoned on the battlefield rather than salvaged. Nakagawa's men fought an equipment war they were already losing on paper, in a defense built almost entirely out of coral, patience, and belief. It is worth pausing on the American side of that same ridge, because the officer opposite Nakagawa was cut from strikingly similar cloth. Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, commanding the 1st Marines, was already a legend within the Corps by 1944, a veteran of fighting in Haiti, Nicaragua, and Guadalcanal, decorated repeatedly for the kind of aggressive, close-quarters leadership that had made his name. Puller's approach to the Umberbragal was to keep pushing frontal assaults into the ridge long after the mounting losses argued for a different plan, and it was his regiment that paid the campaign's single heaviest price for that persistence. By the time the 1st Marines were finally pulled off the line, the regiment had suffered casualties in the range of 50% of its strength, a toll so severe that some post-war historians consider it to have effectively ended the regiment's usefulness as a fighting force for the remainder of the war. Puller and Nakagawa never met, never exchanged a word, and never would, but each, in his own way, kept feeding men into the same 2 miles of coral long after the arithmetic of the fight had turned against caution. The cost sits uneasily against what the island was actually worth strategically. Of the roughly 28,000 American Marines and soldiers committed to Peleliu and neighboring Angkor, more than 10,000 became casualties. Sledge's own regiment, the 5th Marines, counted over 1,200 dead and more than 5,000 wounded across the division by the campaign's end. On the Japanese side, more than 14,000 soldiers and laborers died defending an island that, within roughly a year, many historians would judge to have been strategically unnecessary in the first place, bypassed in the broader arc of the Pacific Campaign almost as soon as it had been secured. Nakagawa was posthumously promoted to lieutenant general for the defense he had designed and died inside. General Inao, his superior on corps, was later captured, held at a U.S. naval prison on Guam and tried for war crimes. It was in post-war interviews conducted with him there that American officers first pieced together many of the details of Nakagawa's final hours at all, an enemy's own chain of command, years afterward, quietly confirming the discipline of a defense they had ordered and then lost contact with entirely. Sledge went home to Mobile, Alabama, finished his education, and eventually became a college biology professor. He carried the weight of those weeks for the rest of his life and would later write about the particular, specific loneliness of trying to explain any of it to people who had never been there, how those who hadn't lived through it could never fully grasp what the fighting had actually cost the men who had. Nakagawa did not write that he had been defeated. He wrote that his sword was broken and his spears spent, the language of a soldier describing the failure of his instrument, not the failure of his cause. That distinction is, in the end, the whole story of Peleliu. The doctrine tested there, go underground, go silent, force what Japanese planners called an endurance engagement, make every yard of ground cost more than it could possibly be worth, did not save the island. It did not need to. It became the working blueprint for 2 far costlier island battles still to come, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. A sword can break and still have done its work. That is the lesson the Marines carried off that ridge, whether they had the words for it yet or not. An enemy who no longer expects to win can still be the most dangerous enemy a soldier will ever face. Peleliu did not change the trajectory of the Pacific War by a single day. It simply proved, at a cost of nearly 25,000 men from both sides, exactly what that trajectory was going to demand before the war was finally over. The sword breaks, the spears run out, and somewhere on the next island in the dark, someone is already digging a new tunnel.